So my favorite question so far has been the question about which of my adventures was my favorite. This is, I think, a good question. Um, a lot of people seem to think I've had a lot of adventures. I don't disagree, but I never really feel like it's that big of a deal because this has just always been my normal life. Um, anyway, I would say my favorite adventure, though, again, in some ways it's not really an adventure so much as just what I've done in my life, was when I lived out of my truck for about 9 months. Basically, I had a job lined up overseas for the following May after I graduated. I had to work a little bit on my thesis until September, and so that left me this kind of odd period in between graduating and also having to work on my thesis and this job. And at the time I was living in Boston, which is a very expensive city, and I didn't want to get either a job for that short period of time because I knew it would be kind of a crap job, or a place to live other than potentially living with somebody else, because it seems like a waste of money to me. So I decided, I had inherited some money from my grandmother when she died, and I had a very good network of friends across the country. I still do. So I decided to basically couch surf with friends for the better part of 9 months. Basically what I did is I put most of my belongings into storage. I bought or rented a storage space in one of those you store it type places. And I put most of my stuff in there. I packed up 4 big Tupperware bins of stuff, which is actually an organizational system I still use to this day. I found that it worked great. I had a bin of summer clothes, a bin of winter clothes, and a bin of in-between season clothes, as well as a bin of kind of miscellaneous crap and reenacting gear. And I put them in the back of my truck, and I went to stay with my first friend, and it just kind of progressed from there. And when I felt that I had stayed long enough with one person, I would go somewhere else and stay with somebody else. And I would basically put out the word of saying, hey, I need a new place to stay. And I would go there. I sometimes drove a really long way, but it was fun. To give you an idea, I was really on the road quite a lot. I didn't really live out of my truck except for probably a cumulative week out of that 9 months. I almost always had a place to stay. But to give you an idea of kind of what that life was like, I remember in the beginning of October, I was staying with a friend in North Carolina, and then he had some stuff to do, so I went up to Washington, D.C., where I stayed with my friends Sarah and John, and I stayed with them about 4 days, and then stuff came up with them, so I needed a place to stay, so I stayed with my friend Kate, who said, oh, you can stay with me, but I'm leaving town in 2 days, so I stayed with her for 2 days, and then this is how I actually met Mark, or how I met him in person for the first time. We had known each other online for a while, and I called him and said, hey, I know you live in Washington, D.C., I know you have a girlfriend living with you, but would you feel comfortable with me sleeping on your couch for, a week or so? So I stayed with Mark and his then now ex-girlfriend for about a week, and I went to their Halloween party and whatnot, and then I left for about a week and went back up to Boston to stay with my friend Colin. And then Mark called me and said, hey, we've got a reenactment down in Charleston, South Carolina that I want to go to and that I think you'd be interested in. Do you want to come down? So I went down, drove down from Boston to D.C., which is about an 8-hour drive. And then the following day, he and I drove from D.C. to Charleston, South Carolina, which is also about an 8-hour drive. And then, or actually probably longer, more like 10. And we went to an event. We got there anyway, we got there Saturday morning. We were there all day Saturday, all day Sunday, and then we drove back on Sunday night. I stayed with them for about 4 days. Then I drove Mark to a reenactment in just east of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, so about 6 hours. And I was originally supposed to stay with a friend of mine in New York the following day, or that night, but it was too late to drive to New York by the time that I got to Pittsburgh, and so I decided to stay there and sleep in a barn. And then, so next day I was going to drive to New York, but I got a late start because I decided to photograph that reenactment, and I couldn't get to New York in time, so I found myself near Philly, called a friend of mine in Philly named Wins, and I slept on her floor for one night, and then my friend in New York was no longer available, so I drove up to Massachusetts to stay with some friends in Amherst, and they said, well, you can stay here tonight, but tomorrow we're all leaving for Thanksgiving, so you're going to have to leave. And I realized I didn't want to be in the US for Thanksgiving, so I drove up to Canada, stayed in Canada for about 2 weeks, came back, stayed in Boston for about 4 days, drove to DC, stayed with Mark for about 5 days, flew home for Christmas, stayed in Texas for like 2.5 weeks, then flew to Chicago to see a friend of mine, then flew from Chicago to Boston, drove from Boston to DC. So anyway, that's what my year was like, was driving around and seeing everybody. And it was a really great time because it was very freeing. I didn't really, I mean, it wasn't that I didn't have any responsibilities, but I didn't have anybody saying, here's where you have to be and here's why. And that was a really great feeling to me. It's something I wish I could have again.